Chapter 531. The chip inside of my head? What is he talking about? I always used the chip inside of my head. In the split second that Eyes of Kronos was activated, I wouldn't have been able to think if it weren't for the chip. Was there another function of the chip that I did not know about? If there was, I wasn't aware of it. It was then that the other me spoke. My attention once again shifted. Pay attention one more time. With his words fading, the Duke's body stumbled backward. This came as a result of the previous punch. As he stabilized his body, there was no longer any look of shock on his face, and in its place was an impassive and unreadable expression. In front of the silent audience, he attempted to keep a straight face. His figure disappeared once more as he expanded his wings, casting a large shadow over the arena. This time his movements were clearly different. It was a lot faster than before. But, bang dash, the results were the same. Walk hack. Casually elbowing the right side, the Duke's body reappeared. It was only a casual elbow, but it was that casual elbow that caused his eyes to widen and his stomach to cave in. A glob of spittle flew towards my face, but my face remained unchanged. Did you manage to see? The echo of his voice reverberated throughout my mind. Finding it difficult to digest what had happened, it took a while for me to answer back. But I eventually did. I have. While the answer was quite easy, it was the concept that I found difficult to grasp. Or even accept it as something that a human was remotely possible of achieving. Observe everything. From muscle movement to the direction that feet and bodies point and eye movement. Connecting everything together. Lowering my hand, I pressed my thumb against the hilt of my sword. The moment I did that, the Duke once again decided to move. But, click dash. Shifting my body ever so slightly toward the right, a subtle clicking sound resonated throughout the arena. Following the sound, the whole arena froze as the Duke's figure once again materialized in front of me. A gaping hole appeared on the right side of his chest. You will be able to predict their movements. Drip, drip. It was only the sound of blood dripping on the ground that echoed throughout the arena. Drip, drip, drip. Trying to comprehend what had happened, the Duke's head rose and fell repeatedly as he stared at his right chest. Throughout the silence, my mouth opened. What a pity. A fluke. A simple and miraculous fluke. It's the only way to explain it. The Duke thought as he kept denying the reality that was presented before his eyes. There was simply no way for someone whose rank was weaker than his to be able to hit him. Impossible. Although he was suppressed, he was still a Duke-ranked demon. A Duke-ranked demon. An existence that was supposed to stand at the apex of all worlds. A figure who had the ability to squash counts with a simple wave of his hand. Or at least that was how things were supposed to be. Drip, drip. But as he heard the sound of his own blood dripping toward the ground, he started to question this notion. How is this possible? His only memory was moving one step before feeling a sharp pain on the right side of his body. Raising his hand to cover his wound, Duke Azanok raised his head. From that moment on, he could see all the stares coming from the participants above. They stared at him with obvious shock on their faces. But that wasn't all. While whispering among themselves, they also displayed a clear sense of disappointment. Is the Duke only this strong? Is he really weaker than that human? He is playing around, right? They tried to be faint with their voices, but as the whispers grew, so did the noise, and their voices were heard by the Duke, whose face twisted savagely. Shut up. How dare you? He wanted to shout at the top of his lungs toward the crowd. But out of sheer willpower he managed to stop himself. The situation was still salvageable. As he raised his head to stare at his opponent, the Duke stared deeply into his eyes. Huh. But the moment their eyes met, the Duke suddenly felt a chill run down his body as he subconsciously took a step back. There was no avoiding the audience's observation, who became noisier as the performance progressed. Did you see that? The Duke took a step back. Is the Duke actually scared? This is pathetic. The Duke heard more and more voices inside of his head with each passing second. All he could hear were voices at this point. But despite all of the voices against him, Duke Azanaka's focus was somewhere else. Staring at his trembling arms, he stuttered. Am I scared? That sensation he felt when he looked at him in the eyes. Was it really a fluke? Or was he just imagining things? When he glanced once again at White Reaper, the sensation he felt before vanished the moment his eyes met. A fluke. the Duke thought to himself. Yes. Updated under world.cgom. Had to be a fluke. How could someone that wasn't even Duke rank scare him? Impossible. It's probably because of all the voices around me. There was simply no other explanation. Whew. Taking a deep breath, Duke Azanok calmed himself down. Drowning out the noise coming from the arena, he slowly started to channel his demonic energy. If count rank doesn't work, I will just take it up a notch. Slowly adjusting his rank in an unnoticeable way, he took a step forward and his vision warped. Reappearing in front of White Reaper, he extended his hand and clawed his head. Compared to before, his movements were incomparably faster. Within a split second, his hand was already nearing White Reaper's head. It was so close, just a couple of inches away, but the Duke's face sank as White Reaper managed to avoid the attack by moving his head back by a narrow margin. Even so, he did manage to graze him just a little bit as a red line traced alongside his cheek. Swoosh dash. Feeling something hurl at him from below, the Duke twisted his body. He too was able to avoid the attack. At the same time he avoided the attack, he raised his head and proceeded to sweep his leg in a whipping motion, hurtling it towards White Reaper's head. Bang dash. His leg was connected. To the Duke's disappointment, his leg came into contact with his arm, which was raised to block his head. The Duke gritted his teeth and tried again. However, as he was trying to shift his body, the Duke suddenly found a hand grasping his foot. Without giving him a chance to react, an open palm came toward his head. A sense of doom rose within the Duke's mind as he watched the hand reach out for his head. Demonic energy erupted from his body as he twisted his body at a strange angle and swung his other foot toward his opponent's head with its back heel. As he performed this movement, he made sure to keep his gaze focused on his opponent. This led him to notice a slight change in White Reaper's expression, as his lips slowly curled into a grin and his left hand shot toward the side of his head. Fuck. By the time the Duke realized he had been baited into doing such a move, it was already too late. Bang dash. With a loud banging sound, the Duke suddenly felt a hand grasp his other leg. Suddenly he found himself being thrown up in the air before being thrown down with tremendous force. Bang dash. Crashing into the ground, sand swept into the air as a crater formed beneath him. In addition, the Duke felt a great deal of pain running down his back as he struggled to open his mouth. The impact was so powerful that he didn't even have time to groan. Again. A voice echoed in his ears. By the time he realized what his words meant, his body had once again been flung toward the air. Bang dash. It's not him. After staring at the white-haired figure in the middle of the arena for a few moments, Lightning Dragon came to this conclusion. It can't be him. It was hard to describe the scene that he was seeing. If he had to use a word, it would have to be a. The most up-to-date NOV underscrolls are published under forherlworld.com. One-sided beatdown. Bang dash. Bang dash. Bang dash. An ear-piercing bang continued to reverberate throughout the arena. It was the sound created by White Reaper repeatedly flinging the Duke's body toward the ground. How could Lightning Dragon think otherwise if that was all he heard and saw? With each swing of his arms, the Duke's body would come crushing down toward the ground, deepening the already formed crater formed from the first impact. The sight. It was something that was being deeply engraved in the eyes of all spectators present as an immaculate silence enveloped the arena grounds. But that wasn't what concerned Lightning Dragon. His concern was that the White Reaper on stage wasn't the one he had fought. His mana control is completely different from when we fought. In addition, he moves a lot more efficiently than in the past. Every one of his movements seems to be perfectly calculated and, his thoughts paused for a second. Leaning his body closer, his eyes opened widely as he pressed his hand on the window to get a better look at the fight. Wait. His eyes slowly started to enlarge. That. Opening and closing his mouth, his face paled as he came to a sudden realization. He's standing where he was at the beginning of the fight. No, rather, he was only one step ahead of where he previously stood. Who in the world was this? Was he really the White Reaper he had once fought? Impossible. Lightning Dragon shook his head. The undeniable reality in front of him shook him to the core. It was at that moment. Enough. He was jolted out of his thoughts by a powerful voice that swept across the entire arena. In response to the voice, a tremendous amount of energy suddenly erupted from the middle of the arena, throwing White Reaper's body back before his figure soon crashed into the other side of the arena. Bang dash. All the spectators clung to their necks in an attempt to breathe under the suffocating pressure. Duke Azunaka's body emerged from the deep crater. His eyes were a deep shade of red and his body was all dirted up and messy. Glaring in White Reaper's direction, the aura coming out of his body slowly kept on increasing. It didn't take long for a Duke-ranked pressure to emerge from his body. Some of the demon's bodies burst into pieces after his sudden aura release. It was that oppressive. But he didn't seem to care as he slowly moved in the direction of where White Reaper crashed, which was at the moment covered by a large cloud of dust. With a wave of the Duke's hand, the dust swept and White Reaper's figure reappeared. Swoosh dash. Sitting on the ground with his back up against the arena wall, White Reaper's head was lowered. The Duke's body began to tingle with bloodlust as he stared at him. He was going in for the kill. However, what he didn't notice, along with the rest of the spectators in the arena apart from Lightning Dragon, was the upward pulling of the edges of White Reaper's lips. Opening his mouth, he slowly mouthed something. Limit Breaker. Chapter 532. Time stopped. The world within my vision came to a halt. From the crowd to the noise, the only thing that stood in front of me was Duke Azunek. Carefully placing my hand on the ground, my body slowly stood up. In parallel with this, Duke Azuneka's face changed dramatically. In a mutter, he opened his mouth. Why, you were hiding your strength? He slowly took a step back. He appeared to be in shock and fear. Not really. My mouth automatically opened and answered. That's impossible. In a state of trembling, he screamed. Do you really expect me to believe that you weren't hiding your strength? You call this hiding my strength? I suddenly felt a wave of disgust wash over my body as I sensed my other self's emotions. I found my head slowly rising up. My eyes soon met with the Duke's. Is it really worth hiding this little amount of strength? What? While the two were conversing, I was secretly trying to grasp what was happening around me. It had to be noted that currently time was flowing at a much faster rate than reality. For the two of them to be able to converse properly, just how fast were they? Not only that, the world around me looked different. Everything looked a lot more colorful as I was able to catch a glimpse of the mana in the air. There wasn't much, in fact there was barely any mana in the air, but it was still there. Regardless, that wasn't what attracted most of my attention. Limit Breaker? These words. This was the first time I had ever heard of these words, and my curiosity about them was at an all-time high. Unfortunately, I didn't have the luxury to ponder over those words as my head glanced around the frozen space, and I suddenly found my calves tensing up. My mouth soon opened. My time is limited. This amount of strength will suffice for now. Following those words, the tension within my legs disappeared. Within a split instant, I found the Duke's face right before me. Swoosh dash. Bringing my fingers together, my hand thrust toward the Duke's throat in a lightning-fast manner. However, unlike in the past, the Duke was able to react appropriately as he dodged my attack by moving his head to the side. It was by a narrow margin, but he was still able to dodge it. After that, he counterattacked with his own palm, pressing it towards my abdomen. Unfortunately for him, like an open book, his every move was clearly visible in the eyes of my other self. With a casual slap of my left hand, his palm changed course. Nevertheless, the Duke didn't give up as he rotated his hand and demonic force burst out of his hand, forcing out a black beam that dangerously aimed at my head. It still proved to be a futile effort in the end. The only thing it took for my other self to avoid the attack was a simple movement of my head, having clearly read his movements ahead of time. The beam soon flew past the side of my ear, before piercing through the pale red clouds in the sky. The Duke's face hardened when he saw this. Clenching his teeth, he prepared to attack again, but in the blink of an eye, my hand had already reached out and grasped his arm, preventing him from doing whatever he was planning on doing. Firmly grasping his hand, my mouth then opened. Give up. My body twitched with annoyance as I felt my other's emotions run down my body. The Duke's resistance clearly irritated him. It's funny how you think you can actually do something to me now that we're both in the same ranks again. You couldn't do anything when we were of the same rank before, yet you think a small power-up would make a difference. My fingers pressed against Duke Azunaka's arm as I squeezed his hand. The Duke's face changed, but my hand continued to squeeze before it compressed it completely and I was able to close my hand into a fist. I could feel the bones of the demons crush inside the palm of my hands. Don't annoy me any further. Pulling my hand back, the hand tore off of the Duke's body and blood began to slowly spill out. My other self glanced at the torn-up hand for a brief moment before throwing it behind me, only to see it stop midair and fall down at the same pace time was really moving at. The same could be said for the blood as it remained still in the air, slowing moving in a downward manner. Wyack. Following my action, the Duke's face twisted savagely as he screamed out loud. As he gazed toward me, a torrential wave of demonic energy burst out of his body, converging toward the top of his palm in the form of a small ball. How dare you? A tremendous force was pushed out as a result of his action. The latest understudies are on website. But as though he could read his mind with just a casual tap of his hand, the ball flew past my head. When the ball flew past my head, I heard a voice speak inside of my head. The mana inside of my body started to circulate in an odd manner. I'll show you one more thing before I end him. Make sure you feel how I control the mana inside of your body. A sudden gesture of his raised his hand and I felt the mana in my body expand outwardly, encompassing the entire arena. The Duke despaired at the sight. But my emotions remained empty. A gradual convergence of mana followed after this, forming a thin yet durable veil that enveloped my entire body. As armor puzzled itself around my body, it didn't take me long to figure out what was happening. Mana agglomeration. I had seen this scene once before, back when Monica was fighting the elders at the monolith. In the years since then, I had been deeply impressed with her gallant and powerful figure. My already tremendous strength multiplied many times as the armor completely encased me. My body was flooded with ecstasy. Immediately after that, my vision completely shifted without me even having a chance to rejoice at my newly gained power. As opposed to before, I could only see a series of black blobs now. There were a couple of more colorful ones inside of the arena, but that was about it. Additionally, I observed that some of the blobs were smaller than others, with the blob representing the Duke being the largest. What's this? I questioned as I tried to make out what was going on. That's not important, look properly. But my question remained unanswered as my other self spoke. Listening to his words, I sharpened my gaze and paid more attention to the blobs around me. It was then. Wait, what are the small circles in the middle of their bodies? Upon closer inspection, I observed small circular balls the size of tennis balls tucked within blobs. Additionally, they appeared to be distributed across different areas of each blob. Then it hit me. Wait, don't tell me. That's right. Those are their cores. How? My inner shock grew further upon learning of this. How was it possible for me to detect where the cores were? Wasn't that something only lightning dragon's eyes could do? Unless. Visit. For the best no_underfruit_g experience. It's not the same. I'm using a different method. It's up to you to figure out how I did it. Following his words, his attention quickly shifted back toward Duke Azanok. Quickly scanning the Duke's body, my eyes soon paused toward his right thigh. There was a visible paling in the Duke's face the moment he noticed my eyes pause on his thigh. He burst into dark flames as demon energy erupted from his body. My hand touched the hilt of my sword in response. When I touched the hilt of the sword, I felt my senses and strength enhance dramatically as I felt the armor around my body brighten up. The fourth movement of the Keiki style. World Splitter. A bright white light flashed. It flashed for an instant before disappearing once more. In the dim light, I could see the Duke's intact figure standing before me like a statue. A look of pure helplessness adorned his face as his eyes widened up completely. Walking up to him, my finger pressed against the top of his head as I extended my hand. A simple tap on his forehead was all it took. Following this simple movement, the Duke's body split into many different pieces that slowly started to expand away from his body. Lowering my head, my eyes soon spotted a small black core that repeatedly pulsated. Reaching out with my fingers, I grasped the core tightly. When I grasped the core, I felt a strange sensation run through my body as a foreign force tried to enter my body. Nevertheless, my other self didn't seem bothered by it, simply waving it off as if it hadn't happened in the first place. While feeling the sensation of the core running through my body, I thought to myself, cold. The core was cold. Very cold. It felt as though I was holding a ball of ice. In that moment my mouth opened and I muttered. 2 seconds. Blood splattered all over the arena as the remains of the Duke's body lay on the ground. Splat, splat, Splat. Silence. A stunning silence enshrouded the whole arena as I felt all eyes pause on me. Even then, I could do nothing about it as I wasn't the one in control of my body. Plack dash. Breaking the silence was a low smacking sound as my other self casually tossed the core in my hand. Gazing at the spectators in the arena stands, he continued to silently play with the core in my hand. Plack dash. Plack dash. Plack dash. It wasn't until he repeated the motion 5 more times that he finally stopped. Once he did, raising his head, he opened his mouth and muttered. So, is no one going to say anything? Chapter 533. Prick, prick, prick. A large black palm hurled down toward 3 figures emitting a powerful aura as cracks formed around a large blue planet. He's here. An orange glow enveloped the body of one of the figures, causing her to scream out in helplessness. As she raised her hand, she cast a translucent yellow barrier around herself and the 2 other figures beside her. Her actions prompted the 2 other figures to release their own barriers as well. Within seconds of the 2 releasing their barriers, the large hand came into contact with the first barrier. The outer barrier cracked immediately as the faces of the 3 individuals behind it paled significantly. Seeing that the situation was critical, the 3 exerted even more power on the barrier. When they tried exerting more power, their bodies glowed brighter. Unfortunately, their struggle was futile. Seconds after their hues expanded, the first barrier crumbled into thousands of pieces. After the first barrier, the second followed and the third followed after that. All 3 individuals were soon pressed down by the hand. A look of helplessness flashed across their faces as their bodies were sent crashing down against the ground. Bang! Immediately after the explosion, a large crater formed on the ground. After that, the sky began to split and a tear soon appeared. Stepping out of the tear was a white-haired figure with scarlet-red eyes. As his gaze seemed to encompass every existence within the world, his presence enveloped the entire planet. Casually taking a glance at the 3 people below, he closed his eyes and took a deep breath. This will do. Extending his right hand, fissures started to form around him. Crack. Crack. A horde of black humanoid creatures emerged from the fissures. It didn't take long for the sky to be overrun with demons as more demons emerged from the large fissures in the sky. While looking at the sky in despair, the faces of the 3 people below the ground paled further. It was from that moment that they understood that their world was no longer theirs. It had fallen into the hands of the demons. It was at that moment that a figure suddenly stepped out of the portal. An all-powerful pressure bore down on the world the moment his figure emerged. It even rivaled that of Jezebeth. Of course, that was only applicable in this case as Jezebeth wasn't using his real body. Nevertheless, it still spoke measure of his strength. After scanning the area with his eyes, they soon came across Jezebeth. His back unknowingly straightened once his eyes paused on him. He quickly made his way toward him. As he approached Jezebeth, all the demons beside him distanced themselves from him. In a respectful tone, he bowed his head. Your Majesty. Emichum. While Jezebeth scanned the world with his eyes, he nodded his head without paying attention to him. The demon didn't seem to mind this as he patiently waited for his orders. His wait didn't last for long as Jezebeth soon opened his mouth. I want this world corrupted within a year's time. With those words, the demon's face spread into a broad grin. Looking down at the 3 figures below, his smile deepened as he took in their despairing looks. Bowing down his body lightly, he responded. Understood. His reaction suggested that he took enormous pleasure in torturing his prey. Glancing at Jezebeth once more, he tried to dismiss himself. If there is anything else I can assist you with you. Wait. As the demon was about to leave, Jezebeth opened his mouth again. In an instant the demon halted. A respectful tone immediately emanated from his mouth. Is there anything you need, Your Majesty? Looking into the distance, Jezebeth pondered for a moment as he fell deeply into his own thoughts. Then from the corner of his eye, he glanced in the direction of the demon. Have you contracted with someone yet? A human to be exact. Contracted? Human. The demon cocked his head slightly and eventually nodded. I have, Your Majesty. With who? A human on Earth. Is he an important figure there? The confusion on the demon's face grew. Nevertheless, he still answered. Who in the right minds would refuse to answer the questions of the Demon King? Recalling his contractee, the demon thought back at the things he told him before nodding his head. He appears to be. I see. Jezebeth's brows furrowed. It was then that he suddenly twitched his face and grasped the side of his head, startling the demon. Your Majesty? It's nothing. Raising his hand to stop the demon from approaching him, Jezebeth's face changed slightly as he softly whispered. My memories are still not intact. Taking a deep breath to glance at the demon, he closed his eyes. When he opened his eyes again, he gazed deeply at the demon opposite. His next words caused the demon's face to change. Tell your employee to pay special attention to those around him. There may be a cancer lurking within his organization. A cancer that will destroy everything that he's built up within a couple of seconds. What do you mean, Your Majesty? It means exactly what I said. Make sure you tell this to your contractee. Before the demon could reply, Jezebeth's face suddenly changed. A powerful wave of pressure suddenly escaped his body, causing all of the demons who had just arrived to hold their hands at their throats, trying to breathe. Ignoring their struggle, Jezebeth's face progressively darkened before his lips pulled into a thin smile. You bastard. You already knew I was going to be here, weren't you? As his brows furrowed tightly, his smile quickly faded. Closing his eyes to sense something, it only took an instant for him to figure out exactly where he was. As he pondered inside his mind, his brows tightened more once he realized where he was. How troublesome. He thought inside his mind. The distance. It was quite far. Had he been in his normal body, he wouldn't have had much trouble going to him directly, but he wasn't. Nevertheless. Glancing at the demons around him, his eyes paused on the demon closest to him. Keep the words that I've said to you in mind. His gaze drifted to the other demons and he began speaking loudly. Make sure you convert all of the mana in this world. You have 1 year's time. Raising his hand, he swiped it toward the empty space in front of him. A fissure formed in front of him. A final glance at the demons behind him prompted him to step into the fissure. Upon entering the fissure, his face darkened considerably. Let's see if we can meet each other again. Bang. As my body entered a familiar room, a door crashed down loudly. Helplessly watching my own body walk into Duke Azanaka's office, I asked. What are you up to? Slowly, my body moved toward his desk and sat on his chair without answering. In a casual gesture, he tossed a small pulsating orb into the air while placing both legs on the table. Plack. Plack. During his repeated tossing of the orb, a thin layer of mana coated its body. This was so that the Duke wouldn't be able to regenerate his body. Indeed, the Duke had still not died yet. His actions completely dumbfounded me as I asked. What are you doing? Waiting. After some time he replied. Hearing his voice, I asked another question. A rare sense of urgency rushed through my body as I thought about all the problems that were about to come soon. From the other Duke to the Demon King. The thought brought great anxiety to me. What are you waiting for? Plack. Grasping the ball with my hand, he remained silent for a couple of seconds before answering. For the other Duke to come back. The other Duke? Why? Casually glancing at the orb, the corner of his lips pulled a bit. Instead of answering, he replied with another question. Why do you think I would wait for the Duke in this kind of situation? As opposed to answering immediately, I began to ponder what he said. Given that he wasn't the type of person to act rashly and do something without a proper plan, he definitely must have thought of something. But what exactly was he planning? It was then that it finally hit me. You're planning on negotiating with the other Duke. Pretty much. In response to his confirmation, I had a hard time finding the right words to say. Despite not knowing much about the Duke's current affairs, there seemed to be a conflict between them. Having defeated Duke Azanak and kept his core intact, he could now negotiate with the other Duke. In exchange for the core, he would grant us access to the portal that would lead back to Earth. Or something like that. Not sure about the details yet since he didn't divulge anything yet. But I estimated that it was something along those lines. Furthermore, given that his performance was seen by a lot of demons, the other Duke wouldn't act rashly. Especially after the fight had only ended within 2 seconds. There was no way the other Duke would try to provoke someone like that. It can work. But, the more I thought about it, the more apprehensive I became. It's an extremely risky plan. The plan sounded feasible, but it was also extremely dangerous. Not only because the skill was now on cooldown but because the Demon King was also coming. With him added to the mix, I didn't see how the plan would work out. Don't worry about the Demon King. But as though he could read my thoughts, my other self replied. It will still take a while for him to come here, so we're safe for now. With regards to the Duke. My eyes suddenly sharpened. He will have no choice but to agree to what I will propose to him. There was a sudden tightening of my grip on the orb. This did not last for long, as after a while, loosening my grip, he put the orb away and proceeded to scan the room. Putting my legs down, he started to stretch my neck. I felt a sudden twitch on my lips as the edges slowly started to curl upwards. While we wait for him to come, let's have a look at the place. Chapter 534. Fwop. Tearing through the red clouds in the sky, a figure flew at high speed with a gentle flap of his wings. In the course of his journey he would repeatedly mumble 2 words. White death, white death. His face was strangely expressionless as he muttered those words. A white-haired human? What are the chances of me finding him? The figure flying in the sky was Duke Adramelech, the second duke that overlooked the city of Morian, one of the largest cities in the Pride clan's domain. Currently he was returning from a short trip near the outskirts of the Pride clan's territory. He was there to check the situation as a minor conflict arose during that time. It wasn't a big conflict or anything like that. Nevertheless, that small conflict had enormous political implications. This was simply because it allowed the participating clans to have a reasonable cause of conflict. It was an amusing sight to see. A smile spread across the Duke's face as he remembered the sight he had seen during his brief pause. Since the Pride clan had not been involved, all he had to do was enjoy the show that was unfolding before his eyes. He certainly did. While he regretted having to return before the conflict ended, he nonetheless had to. It was revealed to him that there was something going on in Morian, and that he had to hurry back. It was an emergency message, and therefore he wasn't aware of the detail. Nevertheless, since Duke Azanok had still not contacted him, it meant that the situation wasn't that dire. I'm almost there. Staring into the distance, he was soon able to see the outskirts of a large city. It was the city of Morian. Keeping his wings extended, he slowly began to flap them, casting a shadow over the area below him. Fwop. His body shot toward the city at tremendous speeds. In the midst of his actions he had a sudden thought. I haven't gotten a response from the spy I planted. Did Azanok figure something out? If that was the case, then things would become troublesome. Although they had been keeping their conflicts a secret, for him to suddenly kill his servant. Halting his thoughts there, his face changed. With one more flap of his wings, his body picked up even more speed, and within a few seconds he was already on the outskirts of the city. As Duke Adramelech expanded his wings one more time and forced his body to halt midair, his gaze changed. What happened here? Why is the barrier activated? Slowly descending toward the ground, the Duke stared at the city encircled by a large purple barrier. The moment Duke Adramelech caught sight of the barrier, he knew that things were extremely serious. Particularly since they were only activated in very dangerous situations. One that would even put Duke-ranked demons in trouble. As he spotted the demon in the distance, Duke Adramelech appeared before him. Grabbing him by the shoulder, he asked, "What's going on here?" His Excellency. Duke Adramelech's sudden appearance startled the guard. Suddenly, his look was replaced with one of joy as he stared at the Duke. "Your Excellency. Thank God you're here. Thank God. Since when has anyone been so happy to see me?" They would usually either cower in fear or show a look of utmost respect. Throughout his life as a duke he had never witnessed such a reaction filled with joy. Just what is going on here? Wait. The duke's face contorted as he had a sudden thought. Demonic energy threatened to spill out from his body. Don't tell me Azanok has managed to force the Blood Prince into signing a contract with him. Duke Adramelech's face sank completely. The demon's next words, however, caused his face to freeze as he struggled to comprehend them. Duke Azanok has died. In an attempt to say something, he opened his mouth. Despite his best efforts, he couldn't find the right words to say. The piece of news left him too confused to formulate a proper response. But he wasn't a duke for no reason. Taking a moment to digest the information, he calmed himself and closed his eyes. As he opened his eyes again and examined the barrier that was raised above the city, He concluded that the demon had been truthful. It looks like that bastard Azanok has died for real. I can't even sense his presence. His face turned extremely solemn as demonic energy sprang out of his body. A while later, snapping his head in the direction of the demon, he coldly asked, "Tell me exactly what happened." "Yes, Your Excellency." After bowing down once, the demon began to recount everything that had happened, especially about the man known as White Reaper. From how he became the overlord within a month to how the Duke suddenly agreed to fight him, and everything that happened in between, the demon left nothing. The more Duke Adramelech listened, the weirder his face became. How did something like this happen within such a short period of time that I was gone? The fight lasted for a total of... Stop for a moment. In the midst of the demon's speech, he quickly cut him off. He then proceeded to pinch the middle of his brows. "Do you mean to tell me that while I wasn't here, a new overlord rose to power and managed to kill Azanok?" Taking a look at the Duke, the demon opened his mouth and nodded. "That's exactly it, Your Excellency." As his head snapped toward the arena in the distance, the Duke's brows tightened even more. In an attempt to sense a presence, he closed his eyes, but it proved fruitless as he didn't seem to be able to sense anyone. Anyone of the Duke level. Did he perhaps escape? He quickly shook his head. While his strength made it possible, the barrier surrounding the city would have been destroyed if he had chosen to escape. Accordingly, the overlord appeared to still be in the city. Taking a glance at the demon beside him, he expanded his wings. It was only a matter of time before his figure vanished from the spot as a result of his movements. His destination. Verena. What are you doing? Visit. For a better user experience. While my body was still under his control, I watched as he walked around the room. Over time, I became increasingly irritated. Also, when am I going to get my body back? Not yet. What do you mean not yet? My heart sank. As my other self casually placed his hand on the desk, he looked around. There was something he seemed to be looking for. Eventually he replied, "You can take control of the body anytime you want?" "I can." "Yes." He responded while still looking around the desk. His eyes soon paused on one of the drawers of the desk. "But you would end up suffering the after effects of using the skill." After effects? There were after effects of using the skill? You want to try them? My lips suddenly pulled into a thin smile. Before I could reply, my vision distorted slightly and I found myself back in my own body. Or rather, I could now control it. Clenching and unclenching my fist, I glanced around the place. I don't feel anything. Lowering my gaze to stare at my hands and trying to feel every part of my body, I cocked my head a little. Is there really a... Not even halfway through my sentence, I found my mouth frozen on the spot. Pain. That was the only thing that I could feel as it came radiating in crashing waves that threatened to drown me with every breath. Sometimes there was something else. It was a sharper, more inexplicable pain, but it never lasted long before the other pain returned and everything went black. Ha! Wake up. I didn't know how long had passed, but by the time my consciousness returned, the pain had already left and my mouth opened to release a single breath. It was then that my mouth opened by itself. So, do you think you can withstand the pain? Pondering over my own thoughts, I didn't answer immediately. It was only after half a minute passed that I finally asked, "Do you not feel any pain?" The pain that I had experienced. I couldn't quite describe it in words. It was something that I had never experienced before. Recalling all the types of pain that I had been through in the past, they seemed to be minimal to what I had just experienced. It was a far more concentrated and radiating pain than the one that I had experienced when I broke the terms of the mana contract. Pain. Tilting my body slightly, he pulled on one of the drawers. In the meantime, his lips pulled into a soft smile. Every second, minute, and hour that I exist, I go through a pain that is far worse than that. Do you think that something like this phases me? Hearing his words, I didn't know what to say. Flashbacks of the words he said in the past replayed inside of my mind. During the time when I saw my parents die before me in the illusion. That time. He had said something similar before. In the end, I couldn't help but find myself asking, "Just what sort of past did you have?" Sadly, he didn't seem to be keen on answering as he promptly ignored my words and continued to look through the drawer. It was only after a while that he found a small black box about half the size of my hand. Grasping the box, my lips curled. Casually tossing it in the air before I could ask him what it was that I was holding, my mouth opened. This over here is the key to the arena treasury. If I still had control over my body, my eyes would have opened up. It would have then been followed by a smile. I'm already liking where this is going. Don't rejoice too early. Putting the box away, he slowly walked toward the door of the office. I can only take a few things. If we're planning on negotiating with the other Duke, we can't take too much. Well, obviously. This was common sense. If we took too much, then the Duke would just not bother negotiating with us, and considering that the skill was on cooldown, we really couldn't afford to do this. We couldn't be too greedy. Greed was the best recipe for disaster. Clank. Grasping the handle of the door, my arm pulled back and the door opened. Following this, I slowly walked out of Duke Azunaka's office. Time to collect our rewards. The location of the treasury wasn't that far. It was about a couple of minutes' walk from the Duke's office. Where is the treasury? Oh, over there. Most comforting about the journey was the fact that the demons still inside the arena would shake and tremble whenever I walked, while my other self. To add to that, they were also kind enough to tell us where exactly the treasury was. Looks like we're here. Walking for a further couple of minutes and turning a couple of corridors, my feet soon came to a stop in front of a large metallic door. At the moment, the place was empty as no guards stood in front of the door. Was it perhaps because of what happened or because this was the norm? I didn't know. Regardless, since it worked in my favor, all I could do was secretly express my gratitude. Thank you. Shut up. Scanning the door, my eyes soon paused on a certain squared shape indentation. Softly smiling and taking a couple of steps, my other self took out the small cube from before and placed it in the socket. Rumble. Following his simple movement, a rumbling sound echoed out and the door slowly started to open. Chapter 535. If I had to describe the treasure with one word, then it would have to be messy. As soon as I walked into the room, I saw piles of useless armor and weapons stacked together in a corner. From the way the items were stacked, whoever was in charge of the place had no care for the items as he just carelessly threw them into the room. Regarding the room was relatively spacious as it was about the size of half a football court. Not too big but also not too small. In spite of this, the place wasn't well maintained, with cracks forming on the walls and a rusty and moldy smell permeating the space. Do the demons not care about their own armory? I muttered as I stared at the place. Answering me was my other self as my mouth opened. The demons don't care, it's just that most of the stuff here is useless for them since these are just scraps from some of the deceased contestants. They essentially take any useful item for themselves before throwing the stuff they can't use in this place. Then this isn't a treasury. It's more like a dump. In a way, yes. My head slowly nodded. This is a dump for the demons but an amazing place for anyone else. Moving forward, my body bent down and picked up a certain book. There were clear signs of aging and tears on the pages of the book. Further, the book's cover was dusty so I couldn't see what it was. But from a single glance I could tell that it was something that used to belong to a human. I instantly knew what the book was. Upon brushing away the dust, I saw the title and description of the book, confirming my suspicions. A martial manual. A 4-starred one at that. Iron style. Through a series of different techniques, the user can harden his body and acquire great offensive power. While reading the skill's description, I thought, this skill might fit well with Hein. Several months ago, Hein complained about his lack of offensive power. This skill seemed tailor-made for him. I became increasingly convinced that the martial manual was written specifically for Hein as I thought about it. Through the hardening of the skin, the martial manual not only increased his offensive power but also strengthened his defense. If Hein used the skill alongside his defensive capabilities, then he would become an unstoppable tank. My other self finished my words for me. Glancing at the martial manual for a brief moment, he put it inside of my bracelet. Following this, he examined more items. Whether it was martial manuals, artifacts, herbs, or even skills, this place had everything. Of course, not all of it was useful. In fact, most of the stuff present in the room was rather useless to me. A half hour after entering the place, my other self had pretty much sorted through everything and had taken whatever he could take. But considering that we had to negotiate with the Duke afterward, he didn't take everything. In any case, he pretty much took all the martial manuals he could find. Many manuals ranged from 1 to 2 stars, but there was the occasional 3-star manual as well. Furthermore, he had found 2 more 4-star manuals, but neither of them was useful to me, so I could express my regret secretly. Still took them since I could either sell them or give them to the others. It was at that moment. This is a nice bow. Jolting me out of my thoughts was my other self as I suddenly felt my hand grasp something hard. When I focused on the object my other self picked up, I realized it was a bow. Upon closer look, I couldn't help but agree with his assessment. It really looks nice. The bow's frame seemed to have been constructed of long-lasting ash wood. Its string was made from what seemed to be great quality monster hair, an extremely rare material around the human domain that could go up for 8-digit figures. In addition to wrapping leather around the limbs, the points ended in curved claws, giving it an eerie and menacing feeling. The handle was also wrapped in a dark and ominous skin decorated with carvings. A large quiver made of rare hide accompanied the bow, appearing to be intended to be worn around the archer's belt. In addition to its aesthetics, the outer side was embellished with animal horns, truly giving it a sharp and menacing feeling. And rank artifact. Not bad. Camulet's Rage. Rank. Bow carefully crafted through different. Blood'll Rage. The more blood this bow spills, the sharper and faster each successive arrow becomes. Cooldown 1 hour. The description of the item made my lips curl into a thin smile. After that, my other self quickly tossed the bow into my dimensional space and continued to look through the remaining items. Regrettably, there wasn't anything else that interested me amongst the piles of items. Flame Domain. Creates a domain made out of fire around the user. Deafening. Upon activation, it will temporarily deafen the selected target. Levitation. A brief moment of levity occurs when the skill is used. There were also a couple of other skills, but none of them proved to be useful to me and were quickly discarded by my other self. Not that we had a choice. Since skills were something that demons could also learn, they were much more valuable in the eyes of the Duke. This was regardless of rank the skill was. That, and the fact that I could tell my other self already had something in mind when looking around the place. Not sure how I could explain it. But from the way he was carefully looking around the place in search of something, I knew that there was something important hidden there. Here it is. Fortunately, I didn't have to wait for long to understand what he was looking for, as he soon picked up another skill book from the ground. At a first glance, it looked like any regular skill book out there. However, the moment I caught a glimpse of its description, I knew that this was anything but a regular skill book. Dark Servant. It will grant the user the ability to summon a shadow servant for an extended period of time. There will be a 50% resemblance between the shadow servant and the user in terms of skills and strength. Cooldown period, 5 days. This. In spite of the skill description's simplicity, there were tremendous implications behind it. For a brief moment of time, I didn't know what to say as I just blankly stared at the skill description. As I considered all the different things I could do with it, different scenarios continuously replayed in my head. I slowly became more excited. This will do. Jolting me out of my thoughts, my hand raised and touched the top of the book. Following this, a bright white light enveloped the room, and a multitude of different scenes sprang inside my mind, solidly implanting themselves in there. This process didn't hurt one bit, but it still felt weird. It felt as though something was tickling at my brain. Visit for the best no_underfruit_g experience. Once the weird sensation disappeared, opening my mouth, I exhaled. The skill book in my hand shattered into different bright lights before disappearing into the air. Let's try the skill. Following this, my hand raised and the mana inside of my body started to circulate like crazy. Within the span of a couple of seconds, about half of my mana disappeared. As this was happening, I spotted a translucent black figure emerge from the shadows in front of me as 2 bright yellow pupils stared in my general direction. Taking a closer look at the black figure, apart from its general frame, the figure didn't bear any semblance with me, as it just looked like a shadow. Upon closer inspection, I noticed that the black figure was currently holding a sword on the right side of its body. Silence enveloped the room as the shadow's 2 bright yellow eyes stared in my direction. It was at that moment that my mouth opened. First movement. As soon as those words escaped my lips, the shadow servant quickly seized the sword's sheath and took a stance. While this was happening, my body's mana drained at an alarming rate. Far more than I was comfortable with. Click dash. Then a familiar clicking sound rang out and a bright light flashed. After the bright light vanished, I felt a stinging sensation at the tip of my nose as the servant's sword paused right there. I felt a wet sensation trickle down my nose. It was probably my blood. Raising my finger, my other self pushed the sword away from my nose and nodded in satisfaction. This will do for now. After his words faded, the shadow servant dispersed. With his eyes lingering on the spot where the servant used to stand, my mouth opened. You've probably noticed from this slight demonstration, but you must be careful with this skill. As much as it grants you the ability to summon a servant of similar strength, each of his movements will deplete your mana. The same is true if it is destroyed after battle. After listening to what he had to say, regardless of how much I wanted to find a flaw in his argument, I knew that he was speaking facts. Although the skill was strong, it also had flaws. While these weren't major flaws, it was basically a short-time usage skill that could only be used during short combat situations. If I wanted to use the skill during prolonged battles, then it would only lead to my inevitable loss, as the mana consumption was simply far too monstrous. Glancing around the place, my other self opened his mouth once more. Remember. Click. But it was at that moment that the door of the treasury suddenly burst open as a figure showed up from behind it. A threatening pressure bore out from his body, quickly heading in my direction. Closing my mouth, my head turned to casually look at the guest that had just arrived. A wave of annoyance ran through my body as my head stared at the figure outside. My mouth soon opened. I don't like to be interrupted when I'm talking.